Thanks. And I think this is a very important discussion, but I think we cannot discuss things in isolation and just say, well, we're all for this and we're not for this. And I think you've alluded to the fact yourself that getting a radical model of SUSI is quite unlikely, but we have all made substantial submissions here. And that's why it really concerns me that you would say, leave the highest fees in Europe here. You know, we're okay with that. And take that in isolation, away from all of the other costs involved in going to third level education. And the number of people who have to go to St. Vincent de Paul to pay their fees as well. And I just think we need to be careful about this. And yes, we need to have a substantive discussion. And we need to examine the raw data around all of this. So we need an explanation as to why 11 countries don't have any fees and why we have the highest fees in the EU as it stands. And where that lies and how we can address that. And obviously the Students' Union of Ireland have advocated for a long time for student fees. So to dismiss the concerns they have around student fees and access and completion and all this in it, I think would is not the way to go. So I suppose maybe, do you think it's okay that we pay the highest fees in the EU?
If I could comment on that, Deputy Walsh, it's a very valid point, but I think it brings you back to the overall state funding of higher education. And just to give you a few numbers, excluding research, the public expenditure on higher education in Ireland is 0.6% of GDP. The OECD average is 1%. So 0.6% as against 1%. Yeah. So that is the state input into it. In the absence of that level of state funding, then it's understandable that our fees are going to be higher. So like, this is a three-legged stool, you know.
And that's why I'm saying that we need to discuss it in the whole context of it. And we have an opportunity here to get this right.
Absolutely.
So, but we cannot just say, you know, students will be the cash cows for this to meet. You know, even in terms of student accommodation, we know what's happening in terms of the high-end student accommodation that's being supplied to get the money in, because that's filling a gap as well. And this is why our core funding is so important. I think it, and even in terms of lifelong learning, and I take what you're saying absolutely 100%, but I do think that rather than have a whole plethora of initiatives where you follow the funding, that you have that embed into the core funding, so you recognise that lifelong learning makes an enormous contribution, and why would we not invest in it when we get 9 times return? There is very little other initiatives. When you're making choices and doing cost-benefit analysis, there are very little other places where you can put that money into the future and be guaranteed 9 times return. Sorry for God, but I'm a bit passionate about this, and I wouldn't like us to go away today thinking that everything is okay with us having leaving the fees as they are.
I don't think anyone's saying that we're all okay with leaving the fees as they are. What we're saying is, if you pose that straight question of doing, as Deputy Byrne said, reducing the fees or adjusting SUSI, then you adjust SUSI. But it isn't a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be. And what I would highlight is that underspend relative to other countries. That places us as a system in terms of being very stressed. Student accommodation, that does not fund any other activity. The charges that are made for student accommodation are to pay for the cost of actually building and running the student accommodation. So that isn't a source of income per se. But, you know, we invest from the state 0.6% of GDP. The UK invests 1.6%.
Yes,
that's almost 3 times.
Yeah.
You know,
it's very important.
And yet they have those level of fees, by the way. But and they're not in the EU, so they don't come into the comparison anymore. But we are underfunding as a state, and I appreciate all the other demands on funding. But as I say, the higher education investment that we're making is feeding into our health services, is feeding into our education system, it's feeding into the building of houses and town planning, and you know, I could go on and on.
Yeah, I just wanted to give maybe Marion, I didn't hear from you in the first place.
You have to take into account also that, you know, from my sector, technological university sector is going through phenomenal change, demands being placed upon it by the government in terms of the outcomes that are really achieved by this process. And I suppose recognising the fact that in terms of being able to achieve those outcomes, there's funding needed with regard to that. That transformational change does require funding. Also made reference to the fact that we are awaiting the OECD report in terms of academic contracts and the structure, organisational structure with regard to the technological sector, and that also will, be a drain on the technological universities, and there will need to be funding provided in order to be able to address that as well.
Can I just ask you specifically around the research, because there's so little that goes to technological universities. We now have an opportunity, and I'm particularly interested in the Atlantic, obviously, technological university and the capacity there for competing in terms of research and development. What do we need for that, and how do we do it to make sure that there's a bigger share, firstly going to the technological universities, and secondly along the Western Seaboard?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of technological sector, we will say that we have been the poor cousins in the context of securing funding from an RI perspective. I suppose our allocation has been 5 million static amount since 2019. We're asking that to be increased to 5% of our current grant on the first basis, and then bringing it up to 10% as what our colleagues in the university sector has. So I suppose we are asking in the first instance for parity of steam with regard to the university sector and in terms of the allocation of funding to it. I suppose the other aspect, and to answer your second part, in terms of technological university sector, we are engaged in applied, research, engaging with local industry that obviously fuels the regional development. So I suppose we have seen ourselves, proven ourselves in this respect. I suppose it's given us the opportunity by which we can expand on that. But obviously, we are hamstringed in the sense that we're coming from a very small basis at the moment. If that was increased, it allow us to do more of that work in terms of the regional development piece and the applied research with local industry.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with every word of that. We look at the CSO figures and the gap, the inequality gap, 3 times wider than it was 10 years ago. Yeah. We need to...